Today, he's a successful businessman with interests including Waterstone insolvency, and he's familiar to many through his opinion columns. But when Damien Grant was 26, he was sentenced to 30 months in prison for fraud. He joins me now. What was the fraud?
It was involving gold. So we converted some script into gold, and we smuggled the gold out of the country and got caught, sadly.
What was the motivation?
It was part of a process. It was almost part of a lifestyle. It's a bit like, if you get caught for speeding, how many times had he been speeding before he got caught? And so for me, this was, my early 20s were a bit of probably 5 or 6 years of living dangerously, and that was part of it.
Tell me about the lifestyle.
The lifestyle of living dangerously, not actually that much different from being self-employed. You need to derive income to live, and so you think about what it is that you're going to do, and once you have crossed that Rubicon, if you like, of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, then you're just in that area. So that, okay, well, I've done this one thing now. I've stepped outside of the boundaries of what is commercially and legally acceptable. And once you step past that point of no return, then you're in a world of your own expectations. You're dealing with other people who are also in that world, who operate with, not necessarily without a moral compass, but just not operating within the parameters of what I would now consider to be acceptable. So once you're in that lifestyle, then it does become a lot like being self-employed. So when you're self-employed, you think, okay, I've got to, you know what your expenses are, and you've got, okay, I've got to go out there and I've got to make enough money to maintain what it is that I'm doing. And it's intellectually very interesting because you're operating you're operating against the state. There are people who want to stop you doing what you're doing. There are risks and consequences. So it was in terms of the lifestyle, yeah, it was an interesting lifestyle.
Drugs, chicks.
Need to be a little bit careful because I don't want to. I don't typically talk too much about some of that sort of stuff, and partly because the temptation will be to brag.
Look, this is raw and real. And this is nothing to brag about. I know it's not something you, at this stage of your life, would reflect on and in any way want anybody to think you're bragging. I'm just trying to understand, because we're going to move on to the prison, and I'm fascinated about that.
Yes.
I just want to understand where you were at that. You were 26. You've got it. You must have been earning good money. Were you? Was it good money? How were you spending it?
It was quite good money, and you spend it on lifestyle and travel. And there is a belief at that point, the system is there, and once you beat the system and you get some money out of it, there is an arrogance and a hubris that comes with that. And so, oh my goodness, here I am in my early 20s, and the government and the state and set up all of these things, and I've managed to beat it. Aren't I clever? And it's kind of becomes self-reinforcing. And so you, once you've done it once, and it is in a sense addictive. So you do it once, and then you want to do it again, and you kind of just keep escalating and escalating.
How many hours a day were you working?
Not that many. I usually had something else going on other than just this. I was a student for a while during this period, and I periodically would enter the workforce, and I'd have a normal job, and then I would leave the workforce. And oddly enough, I'd actually made the decision in about my mid-20s to stop and said, okay, look, this is just, this is insane. What am I doing? Why am I doing this? I kind of realized I was making really bad life decisions. Then I stopped, and I actually had a normal job, and I was living a normal life, and had been for quite a reasonable number of times, probably over a year, before the past came knocking.
Why did it come knocking?
You leave enough breadcrumbs out there, somebody's going to follow them. And there were breadcrumbs out there, and people followed them, or the authorities were successful in following them, and came knocking on my door. Yeah.
And so you've avoided successfully sort of talking about any vices, and I don't want to come across as that's what I want out of you. It's going to become apparent in a minute because I'm going to share with you. But what were you doing with that money? How were you living it up?
What was I spending the money on? It's to some extent you invest the money in the next regime, next plan, next scheme, but the sort of low-level activity I was involved in, I mean, you weren't necessarily making huge sums of cash, but you're making enough money to pay the rent and to live. And the main thing you're spending your money on is not actually working. So you wake up in the morning and you don't have to go to work. There's no obligation on you to do anything, and you accumulate a bit of money, and you think, right, so you get travelling, you do whatever it is that you want to do, and then you're thinking about what do I do next, and what you do next. I had a friend of mine, and we did some legitimate trading on cars, and so we would buy cars and then we would fix them and sell them. Completely legitimate activity, but again, it was just kind of like, well, this is something that we're doing that doesn't involve clocking in at 8:30 in the morning and clocking out at 5:30 at night. So there wasn't, in terms of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, there was a depressingly small amount of that. My interests didn't lean in that direction.
So do you have an idea of just how many transactions you would have done over that period of time?
I didn't keep a ledger of it, but the lifestyle went on for probably 5 years or so.
Right, and so what sort of amount of money are we talking about for a deal? I mean, what was the best you ever did? I mean, I know, again, this is not boasting. I'm just trying to understand. It's like, what was the best return you got for the risk that you took on just one of those deals?
That's quite difficult to answer because it's not like a real estate transaction where you would, you buy a house, you spend money and you flip it. But I mean, you're quite tens of thousands type the sort of thing that you could achieve by doing the sort of things that we're doing.
And so you were physically just taking gold out of the country. Is that?
On this particular one, yes, that's exactly what happened. So we some was physically shipped out of the country in a briefcase, and some of it was put in a boat and shipped out. On that particular transaction that unravelled and led to my incarceration.
So that was the big one, and that was the one you got done for.
That was certainly the one I got done for. Yes, and that was the one that, and I don't know. This is the last one I did, but it was. I kind of got to the point in my mid-20s, and I was sitting there thinking, well, do I want to be doing this for another 20 years? And it was fun and it was interesting and there was no real responsibility. But it was kind of an epiphany. I said, well, actually, no. I'd gone back to university at that point and I said, well, maybe I need to just walk away from that lifestyle. And I had enough money I could finish the university without having to work. And so that's what I decided to do. So put that mess behind me, wasn't involved in gangs or anything like that, so it was very easy to walk away. Very much just operating on my own with 2 or 3 others and then move into a different direction. But unfortunately, your past catches up with you, and it did for me. And literally got the knock on the door at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Tell me about that knock on the door at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Well, it was interesting. So there they were, and you could just tell immediately who they were. 4 or 5 officers in civilian dress, but quite clearly detectives. And yep, they were there. They had a search warrant. They didn't drive anything from that. And And it was like, okay, so it sounds terrible, but I wasn't entirely too sure what it was they were there for, which was a bit disconcerting. And right to silence, so I just sat there and had a cigarette and waited for this process, and then accompanied them to the police station, and then began that process. So I got bail, was released, and then it was just the process of waiting to eventually, when I lost bail and pled guilty and began the process.
So how long was that waiting period?
I think I was on bail for about 4 months.
How did you deal with that 4 months? How did you sleep? What was going on in your head? Did you know that you were going to be going away, and how did you deal with that?
It was reasonably tough. So you had a situation where, pardon me, I'd actually got wind that they were looking for me sometime earlier, and for some inane reason, I decided to run, and so I just went off the reservation for probably about a month, and it was completely pointless because where are you going to go? And that in itself was a really interesting experience. So went down the line, stayed with some friends, just kept off the reservation. But you're sitting there thinking, well, you're looking at all of these other people going about their lives, and they have complete control and agency over their lives. But I didn't. I knew that at some point in the very near future. So, yep, I was there. You're in a cafe, you buy a cup of tea, but you are not the same as the next person in line, because the next person in line can decide whether he's going to quit his job in the morning, go back and talk to his wife and kids, do all that sort of stuff. I didn't have that freedom because the apparatus of the state had me in their sights, and they were going to win. So I bought myself a small amount of freedom, but it was illusory. And so in the end, I decided, right, well, I need to go back. So I just went back to where we were living in Mount Roskill, or I was living in Mount Roskill, and then just waited for the knock on the door, and kind of so I didn't give myself up, but I went back there and just waited for that to happen, and by that stage, I was mentally prepared for what was going to happen. I knew what was going to happen. I knew I was going to get a jail sentence, and there was a bit of a grief for the life that I was leaving behind, regret that I had not been able to segue from one life to the other without paying a price. I'd accepted I was going to have to pay a price, and part of me knew that price would follow me all the way through. Didn't necessarily think that I'd be explaining it to the owner of the MBR some 25 years later, but I was aware at some level that was the reality that I had created for myself.
And so the day that you went to court and you knew you were going to be sentenced, what did you take with you?
Well, on the day that I do remember quite very vividly. It was at the district court, and it was just a rollover bail hearing. And the police had gone from being supportive of bail to opposing bail, and without giving me any notification of that, not that they were obligated to. So it was my expectation that I was going to go there and then go home, and then, so we were having discussions about changing my plea and so forth. And then it just dawned on me that this was it, that the curtain was going to draw today. And it was, again, so surreal. The judge stood the matter down until after lunch. So, okay, so I could leave, go downstairs. There's a little cafe just opposite the district court there. It's still there. And so I sat there and I had a cup of coffee and I bought myself 3 packets of cigarettes because, that was the rule. And then went back upstairs and the bail was revoked, and then I entered the system at that point, and I didn't come out for another 16, 17 months. So when I went there that morning, it was not in the expectation that I was going to be locked up. And that I was in remand for probably a couple of months in that.
Tell me about the van ride from the courts to Mount Eden. Were you on your own?
No, there was with a group of people. I don't recall that particular ride. I do remember the emotions of it, and it was the hard thing about remand is the uncertainty of it. So you're in the system, and you know that this is a temporary thing, right? So my offence is relatively minor in the scheme of things. I knew I was going to be spending 1 to 2 years inside, but not knowing how long it was going to be, or necessarily having much of a feel for what the life was going to be like. I remember that uncertainty, and I remember that it wasn't really fear at that stage, but it was the hurry up and wait. So you sit there and you go from being a person who has control over your life. I talked about that in the cafe, where you could go there, you could buy a cup of tea or coffee, and you could buy cigarettes. You can choose who you talk to, who you don't, and you go from being that to being a commodity that has been moved from A to B. That loss of independence, that loss of agency, was probably the thing that stressed me out the most. And for the prison guards, generally a really good group of people from my experience, but you weren't an equal to them. You were something that needed to be moved from A to B, and they had no responsibility to tell you what was going on. You were something that was being processed through the system, and in exactly the same way as you might not, if you're in charge of a warehouse, you don't necessarily care about the bricks that are sitting in there that have to go out to the factory the next day, and so that's what it was like as somebody who was caught in that system. You were moving from A to B, and you had no control, you had no agency, as I quite like that word.
I don't mean to trivialise it, but just out of curiosity, did you get to keep the 3 packets of cigarettes?
I smoked 1 packet of cigarettes that day. I do remember I got to the end of that day in the cell, and I'd actually managed to smoke the first packet. Yes, I did manage to keep the other 2 packets of cigarettes. And then you had not a ration system, a canteen system. So you could buy once a week from the canteen. But it actually took them about 3 weeks to set the canteen system up. So I kind of worked out how long it would be before I got my first canteen. And then I had to ration my cigarettes. It was like 3 or 4 a day to stretch out to that. Now that was hard. So when do you smoke your cigarettes?
Did you have a cellmate?
Yes.
The first night?
I believe so, yes. Oh, I can't be certain, but certainly I do remember having cellmates in remand. Yeah.
And what was were you scared? At any point?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember the first when you go into Mount Eden, and I don't know what it's like now, but we're talking 25 plus years ago now. But so you walk into the big yard, and it is not fair to call it the black hole of Calcutta, because that was kind of like 100 people squeezed into a small room. But it was intimidating. So there with probably 3 or 4 other white faces, no Asians at that point, and that was mainstream. So you had mainstream and you had segregation, mostly for sex offenders. And so for the first 3 or 4 days, you try and keep to yourself, but you can't. You're not going to keep to yourself. It's nonsense. But then I was invited to play Crash. And I said, sure, yes, I'll play Crash. Crash is full-on rugby, full contact rugby on asphalt, which sounds a lot worse than what it actually is. Crash was cathartic because you're sitting in this environment, no human physical contact, and that's really important. That's one of the things you don't think about when you're segregated in that sense. You don't have physical contact. You don't touch people. You don't interact with people. You don't really shake people's hands, and certainly no intimate contact. and crash was a way to fulfill that. So by and large, people respected you would get tackled and you would go down, but you're wearing the full denims, right? So nobody really got injured, or not injured badly, and there was no violence on the field, and it was a bit of a, what will this white guy do? I could just.
You're a big lad too. I mean, and at 26, you'd be quite intimidating. You're a decent size now.
I may have been physically, but I think I'm not too sure whether I gave off that. I think I gave off the feel that potentially somebody who could be pushed around. But when the crash, and I really enjoyed crash. So I would look forward to playing it in the remand yard. And I got tackled and I got hit and injured and hit other people within the confines of the game. But that was, I can't describe, and it was an opportunity to engage with other people who were there in this, and it didn't matter what you were doing, why you were there, how long you were around for. The issue was, there's 6 of us, there's 6 of them, and you get in there and you play it and you joke and you laugh and you form some sort of a community. There was one incident though that there was one guy in there who was in for sex offences, and it was awful. This guy was taken behind the toilet cubicle and beaten hard, and the screams and the cries, it was awful. And the guards came in and took him to segregation. But that was a terrifying, just how Lord of the Flies vulnerable you potentially were if the mood of that group of people went against you. But it didn't in my situation, and whether it was by good luck or good management, I don't know. But I was probably in there for maybe 2 months, 6 weeks or 2 months, something like that.
And then on to...
then down to a prison called Waikeria. So I was sentenced, then sent down to a prison called Waikeria, which was an interesting place. Wasn't really set up for... So we were in transit, and so you're basically on 23-hour lockup. Not for punishment. That came a little bit later, but... you just bored out of your mind. My God, nothing to read. You weren't sentenced. You were just in the process of being assessed. Where should we put this person? I can't remember how long I was there, but then I went from there down to the prison farm, a place called Hautu down in Turangi, and that was where I spent the bulk of my sentence after that. And that was a prison farm, and so you had your own room. That was the first time in the process I had my own room, so you had your own room. And again, it was a little bit of the Lord of the Flies type environment, but you had much more control over what you were doing. And the system, and I assume it works the same now, it's segmented. So if you behave yourself and you play within the rules, then you can have a relatively easy experience. So there's violence and there's bits and pieces, and I've spoken before. Sometimes I was a victim of violence, and on occasions I was the instigator of violence. And you can't be afraid of engaging with people on that level in that environment. If somebody wants to fight you, you really have to engage with that, and it almost doesn't matter if you lose. You can't run away. You have to get involved in it. And because although I didn't necessarily have the appetite for that, I was large, so you just got to play that game. But that there was probably half a dozen incidents like that in the 13 odd months that I was at Turangi. I mean, they were bad, but it wasn't Staff did a piece on it, and I did a bit for them, and they were talking about the violence in prison, and it's there. It's always there. It's always there. But you can choose not to engage with it. It will still find you out, but you can choose not to engage with it, and it doesn't need to be a part of your experience. If you want it to be a part of your experience, you are going to find yourself removed from that relatively benign environment of the prison farm and move to a medium and a maximum security. And so that discipline worked really well, and the incentives not to mess up were huge. The problem is that they were dealing with people who didn't necessarily have the self-control that, even though they knew that a fight would lead to medium security, the anger that they would feel at some slight that had occurred right there, the cost-benefit analysis didn't work out, and so the fight happened, and then they both end up in medium security, and they would regret it afterwards, of course, and that they would come back after 6 months or whatever it is. But yeah.
Would it be fair to say, you're in the insolvency business now? I mean, are you smarter for the experience of what life skills you learnt in prison?
I don't know that I would say that I'm smarter. I think we all go through life and we accumulate scars as we do. I don't know. I don't know that it made me smarter. I mean, I certainly had a couple of epiphanies sitting in there. What the hell did I do, and why did I do it? And what am I going to do from that point on? Right. So okay, fine. I came out in my late 20s, and it's kind of like, what do you do with your at that point? And that for me was probably the scariest, hardest thing to get my head around. What was I going to do? And I didn't really have an idea. I did think about a life in academia. One of the people I admire is a guy called Greg Newbold, who works down and he's, I wouldn't say he's made a career. But obviously from his perspective, he did what he did. And then an academic life makes perfect sense from that perspective, right? And I did think about an academic career. I studied economics, but I don't know that I have the aptitude for academia.
Did you actually work when you were inside?
Oh yeah, we did. We did work. So I worked on something called the fencing gang. So I learned how to build fences, which hasn't transpired into a particularly useful life skill. Although I do now own 4.5 hectares of land out in Waitaki with my wife and kid. But I still employ fencing contractors when stuff needs to get done, sadly. I think it definitely taught me some life skills that I wouldn't have acquired otherwise, in terms of dealing with a degree of mental toughness. So you're in that situation and you're in that world, and the life it's gone. Your life is wrecked, and it's, for a lot of people in there, their life was probably ruined before they got there. And so for them, coming in of prison and out of prison, it's just kind of what they expected. They've seen other family members come in and out. So there's probably 60-70% of the people in that situation. Then there's another group of people whose the fact that they're in there has damaged their window of opportunity, if you like. And those are the people that really struggle in some ways, as I did, because it wasn't just the time that I was there. It was the fact that this thing that I had done would now define me, and for a lot of people still defines me, and that's fair enough. That's I can't argue with that. But that was hard to get your head around. And then so the life skills maybe have come after that. It's in the situation where, okay, here I am, and this is how some people are going to define me, but I need to choose not to be defined by that. And to some extent, that's a forlorn hope, right? Because some people will never deal with me because of that criminal past, and that's fair enough, and that's their right. I don't begrudge them that. But then you kind of got to say, well, okay, there's a bit of grief about that, because what sort of commercial life could I be living if I didn't have that? But then again, look at the life that I'm living now, it's a pretty sweet life, to be honest. I can't complain. And so it's just trying to reconcile in your head about the fact that lots of people don't want to deal with you or engage with you because of it. That requires a degree of mental discipline that I think I potentially, to some extent, picked up while I was inside.
So it took you a bit of time to win over the confidence of the editors at MBR, and you won that confidence because of some very timely topics that you raised. How have you found, being a columnist and a contributor to MBR? How is,
given that the MBR broke the story?
Yeah.
It's honestly, I don't actually think too much about that. You go back, and I understand that people will assess me because, okay, that's Damien Grant. What do we know about Damien Grant? He went to prison. I was very lucky because I did make the decision. I remember when I was first picked up by Maria Slade from the Herald when she was working at the Herald on Sunday, and she picked me up as a columnist. And I remember thinking, if I take this, my past is going to come back to haunt me. It's just going to happen. And then you got to make a decision. Do you spend your life hiding in the shadows in fear, worried about what might happen, or do you just decide, I don't care, I'm just going to do it? And so I'd been writing for the Herald on Sunday for maybe 3 years or so when the NBR broke the story about my criminal past. And so I think I was very lucky in the sense that a lot of people had the opportunity to form an opinion of me, and then when they learned about the crime, that was another piece of information they had about me. So when they thought about me, they thought about, he's a liquidator, he writes for the paper, he does these things. And so when the NBR story broke, I'd also been quite selective. I told a whole group of people as well. So when the story broke, people were able to say, okay, all right, well, that's another piece of information we know about this person. And so I think that I was very fortunate. Had it happened the other way around, I think I would have found it much harder. And so likewise, writing for the NBR. So obviously, if I submit something to the NBR is going to sit there and they're going to look at that. And in the mind of the NBR, yep, I come with some baggage. And but then also they say, well, he's done some other stuff as well. But maybe it's the fact that you guys are journalists. You've got the ability to compartmentalize stuff. And so, yep, okay, this is what he's done. Let's look at what's on the four walls of this page and decide whether or not this is something that we're going to run with. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's credit to like the NBR and also obviously I write for another organisation now that they are able to say, okay, he's got some baggage, but we are going to assess him on what's in front of us. And that also happens in the commercial world a lot. New Zealand is, in a lot of ways, remarkably benign. So I remember about 18 months ago, I was pitching for work to liquidate a Ponzi scheme running out of Christchurch. And there was a group of creditors in the room, and I just put it out there. All right, I've been to prison for fraud. It was some 20-odd years ago. There it is. Does anybody have any objections? And it was obvious that most of the people already knew. But they'd also heard other things about me. So they'd read other things that I had done as a liquidator. So if the only thing they knew about me was that, then I think they would have said, I'm sorry, we want to go somewhere else. But because they were able to objectively say, okay, we know 5 things about Mr. Grant. The criminality is 1. There's 4 other things. We're going to make an objective assessment. And I think I am incredibly lucky that there are so many people, including the NBR and the other papers I write for, and and the people who refer me work, that they are prepared to say, okay, let's look at all of the things we know about this guy and make a decision. And I sometimes think that if you think about people we know in our own lives, and you know that person and you know a dozen things about them and there's one bad thing you know about them, you are able to objectively make an assessment on the totality of that person. But when that person gets caught in the media, sometimes I think the media doesn't take into account the ability of individuals to objectively assess somebody. So they might say, right, we know one thing about this person, and that's what we're going to write about them, and that should define them. But the people who actually know that person and engage with them have a wider view of them, and I think the fact, and I wrote about this for an NBR piece about a year ago, the fact that there's so much more information about somebody now out there in social media and all the blogs and the proliferation of websites, people are able to say, okay, I'm going to Google Todd Scott. What do we know about him? There's multiple bits of stuff. There's not one thing. Whereas maybe 30 years ago, there might have been one thing that they read about in the paper. And because there was no other sources of information about that person, you tend to focus on the most sensationalist aspect of it. And if that's all you know about the person, then that's how you will define them. So in some ways, I think it's the proliferation of media sources that I think has been quite beneficial for me.
I hope that's not your lawyer ringing you right now to tell you to get off the air. Your final question, why did you agree to come on Raw and Real?
Why did I agree? One, because you asked. And it's, I don't put my past out on my website, and I don't push it. It's not a point of difference that I seek to sell myself or services with. But when you look at what I do, I'm a liquidator. I've got millions of dollars sitting in my trust account. I go out there and I asked people, I asked banks, I was in a meeting yesterday with the Inland Revenue Department. I'm asking for their support. I want people to support me and give me work and engage with me. And part of the quid pro with that is that I need to be, if somebody wants to ask me about these things, then I kind of feel if I am asking people to engage with me despite my past, then I can't hide it. So, and if you like, I kind of look at it like this. People, like yourself, who don't have a conviction for dishonesty, you are entitled to a presumption of integrity. You are entitled to think that other people out there will assess you as an honest person. Now, your actions beyond that can confirm or dissuade people against their default position, but you are entitled to that presumption of honesty. I'm not entitled to that presumption of honesty because I have these convictions for dishonesty. So that if people use that as their starting point, I can't complain about that. That is their right. What I need to do is I need to demonstrate to the wider commercial community and my staff and the banks and the ID and all the other people who engage with me that I am entitled to be considered as an honest person despite what I've done in the past. And if I am going to ask people to do that, then the quid pro quo is if somebody like yourself says, hey, I want to talk about this stuff, I can't necessarily duck away and hide. I mean, I don't go out there to talk about this stuff. I would rather nobody did talk to me about this stuff. But given that I lead a relatively public life compared to what I could be, then I need to accept that some people are going to be interested in what I've done.
Damien Grant, I really appreciate you accepting my invitation.
It's a pleasure, Todd.
And I appreciate you joining us. Please, if you've got any comments, leave them down below. Catch you next time.